the case of a North Korean collapse, the international community would suddenly be confronted with the monumental task of caring for 23 million malnourished and displaced North Koreans. In what would be one of the largest stabilization operations in history, how would North Korea's neighbors respond to the movements of millions in even the most benign collapse scenario?
Hello, welcome to the panel, which, as you heard from the video clip, is looking at the implications for China and other countries of what would happen in the event of a future North Korean collapse, what would happen to the 23 million North Koreans left and who would care for them. I'm Lucy Williamson, I'm the BBC's Seoul correspondent, and I'm going to introduce an expert panel for you. 5 experts today, so they're all going to stick to their 5-minute allotted time, right? And we have here on my left is Dr. Bruce Bennett, who's a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. He also previously worked for the US Defense Secretary and for the militaries of America, South Korea, and Japan. Next to him is Dr. Cheng Xiaohe, who is a professor at the School of International Studies at Renmin University, and he's a specialist in China's foreign relations. On to his left is Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt, who holds the chair in political economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research. Mr. Miyake Kuni, next to him, is research director at the Canon Institute for Global Studies, also president of the Foreign Policy Institute, and previously worked for Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at the end, Dr. Shin Beomchul, who's director of the North Korean Military Studies Department at Korea's Institute for Defense Analyses, and he also advises both the National Assembly and has been a senior policy advisor to South Korea's defense minister in the past. So that's our panel, and perhaps, Dr. Bennett, you could start with introducing the topic.
Certainly. As we think about refugees, we have to remember that it is far easier to meet the humanitarian needs of people when they are still at home in their jobs and operating there. If they displaced, if they start moving towards borders, then the things we have to take care of are much greater. And so that tells us that we need to be thinking about early intervention with humanitarian aid in a collapse situation. So where do these people live, and what do we have to do to reach them? If you look at the North Korean 2008 census, which has a lot of problems in it, but anyway suggests that about 9 million of the North Koreans live in coastal counties. That's a situation which we could potentially deal with through ports and so forth. There's about 4 million North Koreans who live directly over the border of North Korea across the DMZ and before you get to Pyongyang, but a little over 1 million of them are along the coastlines as well. And then you get almost 12 million who are in the Pyongyang and further north area who are in the interior in the country. Much more difficult to get to with any kind of humanitarian aid or supplies. The other kind of thing that you have to think about is what's the environment that you would be going into to try and take care of these people? Well, not only will the civilians be starving to death, so will the military. Food is going to be scarce for everybody. And when food is scarce for military and security service people, they usually aren't shy about taking it away from the civilians. And so if you simply try to inject food aid and other assistance, it's generally not going to reach the people you really want it to reach. And so you have to conclude fairly quickly that's a problem. Your other problem is you may well have civil war going on, certainly conflict between individual groups. Individual security of the civilians probably will deteriorate significantly. You don't have a situation where it is just a humanitarian problem. Fundamentally, the bottom line is this is a case where you probably have to have military intervention and not just humanitarian intervention. Military not only to provide security and stability as you're operating, but also as a distribution means. If I have to meet some 11 million people, the needs of 11 million people in the interior of North Korea, I've probably got to do that by air like I did with the Berlin airlift. But the daily quantities are daunting that we would be thinking about. So we have a framework of a problem that's challenging. We probably have to use military forces. And in most cases, we're going to want to co-opt the North Korean military rather than fight it. Doing that is going to take food, it's going to take selective amnesty, it's going to take other arrangements. Gives us an interesting portfolio with which we must deal, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dr. Bennett. Dr. Cheng.
Thanks, Asan, for kind invitations. And it's always good to come over here to exchange views with old friends and new friends. And we are talking about the refugee issue. Refugee issue actually is a real one, even though the regime in Pyongyang still is stable. But when we're talking about these issues, we need to look close at the situations in North Korea, because these two issues are closely connected. I'd like to offer a brief assessment of the situations since the third nuclear test. You see, it's domestically, Kim Jong-un, the young leaders, quite successfully consolidated his power base. You see, in the past 1 year, he successfully assumed all the important positions through the formal procedures, and also did 3 big things: 2 satellite launches, and also the nuclear test. And he made one important achievement from North Korea's perspective. The 2nd November's satellite launch was a success. So the 3 big issues create a crisis on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, as new leaders, these young guys need some kind of crisis to boost his reputations, to test his leadership skills. And he did so. This is the one side of one coin. And internationally, you see the DPRK's external environment worse off in a dramatic ways. And in its relationship with the United States, you see the DPRK is threatened to use its nuclear weapons against the United States. And this afternoon, I consult Professor Rosman whether or not some other countries threaten the United States with the nuclear weapons in history, in Cold War histories. And Professor Rosman replies, no. Even China and the Soviet Union did not threaten to use nuclear weapons against the United States. So it's poor and weak and small countries threaten to use nuclear weapons against the United States. That's an extraordinary step. As one of the consequences of the provocations, and United States move its military forces to these regions, such as the discipline's most advanced jet fighters, and also the SBX, land-based, sea-based radar systems. So the anti-ballistic missile systems in this region has been strengthened. And in terms of inter-Korea relationship and President Pyeong-hui's trust-building process has never had a chance to take off. And the diplomatic space that the South Korean could maneuver has been badly squeezed. The Kasan's industrial complex, it's faced as dire situations. We do know when the Kasan's industrial complex will shut down. So it's a combined, China relationship. China relationship with DPRK is also experienced some kind of dramatic changes. Since January, you see the Chinese embassy to Pyongyang, its information bullets has not been updated. And in the recent earthquake China suffered in Yunnan, and Kim Jong-un's conspicuously absent from the long list of foreign leaders who sent condolence messages to China. So these are the typical parameters indicate the relationship between China and DPRK has been worsened off. So all in all, the external environment, the DPRK is facing right now has been worse dramatically. So combined domestic situations and the internal situations, hard to say whether or not the Kim Jong-un emerged as a big winners. But I like to say, seemingly, for the time being, he emerged as a winner with a big loss. So that's the basic situations in the DPR case I'd like to share with you guys.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to stop here.
Thanks. Dr. Eberstadt.
Over the past 20, almost 25 years, thinking about the post-DPRK future of the Korean Peninsula has been tremendously affected by the German experience. And we might even say that most of the thinking that's been written about a Korean reunification has been thought about through a reflection of a German mirror. And it's easy to understand why this should be the case. I mean, it's the exigence of events. This has happened immediately in front of us. This has been unfolding before us for the last 2 decades. Germany, like Korea, is a divided nation, ethnically homogeneous people. Eastern Germany was a communist society that ended up collapsing. And not to put too fine a point on it, it attracted attention because German reunification has been a tremendous success, whatever footnotes and asterisks one wishes to assign to that. It was politically almost entirely without violence, despite enormous subsidies. There's been an economic convergence between the two sides. Wealth creation has continued, and nowadays, what do we hear in the European crisis about Germany? Germany's too strong. The economy is too rich. They're giving too much direction to the rest of Europe. It's been a very successful experience. It's kind of funny that when we have a U.S. ROK alliance with so many Korean and American friends, that we don't think of some of the other historical analogies that might be able to inform our thinking. Historical analogies are never perfect, obviously, but one of the historical analogies which should jump out at American and South Korean friends was the U.S. experience with reunification. The United States had a reunification. We called it Reconstruction. It happened back in after the 1860s. It went on for a very long time. And in some ways, you could even say that the U.S. analogies for thinking about a reunification might be closer to the Korean situation than some of the German analogies. I mean, for one thing, East Germany was never an independent state. It never really could stand on its own feet. It was a satellite without outside support. East Germany immediately would disappear. The South had an ideology of its own, no matter what you think of that, and it had legs. It could last. East Germany's experience only lasted about 4 decades. The Southern experience with the Southern system in the United States lasted for generations. It lasted between our independence and the end of the U.S. Civil War. It was about the same length of time that the North Korean system has been underway. And when you get into a multi-generational system like that, certain organic things happen that may provide more similarity there. Obviously, East German and North Korean communism are very different animals. One of the things that's so tragically characteristic of North Korean communism is its system of political classification of population, where people are marked for life and really separated and segregated into different castes, which is largely intergenerational. We had something like that in the United States as well, in the South. And in some ways, that correspondence may be closer to what we see in North Korea than East German communism. And finally, not to put too fine a point on it, East and West Germany never went to war against each other.
in the United States, we had a reunification after a terrible, bloody, costly, bitter war which left lasting historical animosities. So what happened in the American experience with reunification? Well, I'll tell you what didn't happen. We didn't see an economic convergence between the two parts of America, not for decades, not for generations. Actually, they diverged further. Partly they diverged in terms of economic growth, but they also diverged in terms of human capital formation. Educational standards in the two parts of America diverged after our reunification. Health standards in the two parts of America diverged after the reunification. And actually, for large parts of our defeated America, life expectancy declined for decades. This is something which you don't hear about, written too much about in American history nowadays. We've forgotten some of these things, but they're not things we should forget. Lessons should be learned, not forgotten. For many decades after the beginning of the American reunification, there was retrogression in living standards for large parts of the defeated population. I mean, in parts of the American South, even up until World War I, income levels for farmers were lower than they'd been in the antebellum time. Really dramatic things. Why did it happen this way? There were a lot of different reasons for why it happened. Some things that didn't happen. We didn't have a lot of mobility between the South and the North for decades and even generations. We had a painful problem with extending civil and political rights to the defeated population, and especially to the population which had been most subjected to oppression in the South. We also came into the beginning of thinking about reunification with a set of plans that almost immediately were cast away. And then we went through a sort of an ad hoc series of changes that included bringing in representatives from the victorious side to administer the South as the defeated side as they saw fit. I could go on with this potted history, but I think you'll see my point. The United States experience offers, I'm afraid, a wealth of lessons on what not to do in a reunification. This did not prevent the United States from rising economically. It did not prevent the United States from eventually becoming a superpower. The United States experience, however, could have been much less painful and I think much more socially easy with different policies. That history can't be undone. But it is a situation that our Korean friends, I think, can learn from.
Thank you. Mr. Miyake.
Thank you, Lucy. First of all, I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for organizing and inviting me to this great organization of the gathering. Although the title of this theme meeting is the New World Disorder, but I think in the word of Asan, there's no disorder. This was perfect, and I was so deeply impressed. But having said that, we have some disorder in the Middle East. And I was a Middle East expert. I was an Arabic language officer in the Japanese Foreign Ministry for 27 years. So I'm relatively new to this part of the world, although I have only been to DPRK once. So it's not enough to understand. So that's why I don't think I should be making comments on the North Korea, but I just want to share with you some of my thoughts on what would happen to us if something breaks out in North Korea, and what would be the Japan's response to that, especially in terms of refugees. I cannot violate my obligation of security clearance, so I only use the reported numbers, but I think shouldn't be too different from the reality. So what if we have a few million refugees, if something happens in North Korea? And if that's the case, probably as early as in 1927, Japanese government reportedly made a research on the number of refugees which might come to Japan. And the conclusion was that, reportedly of course, the number of North Korean refugees alone during the crisis in the Korean Peninsula are to be as many as 100,000 to 150,000 of them would be aboard vessels headed for Japan's western coast. So they may come. Although the number of refugees depends on how such crises in the peninsula break out. And many of them may more likely to be headed for China or ROK, unless you build a wall. So Japan still seems to have enough additional facilities or capacities to accommodate such a big number of refugees who really require humanitarian assistance, which we will provide. Japan, but at the same time, we have to be very careful. Japan may also have to prepare for the situation where some of those 100 or 150,000 refugees may not be refugees, maybe a different group of people. For example, special operation forces, soldiers, or North Koreans intentionally send them. I do not know. In order to confuse the Japanese government, I do not know. But we have to be very careful. We really like to help them, but at the same time, we have to be prepared for such possibilities. So anyway, such possibilities may further complicate the measures to help them in Japan. So in such crises, I think they are most likely Japan-US Security Treaty Article 6 situation. That's or I would say it's a situation in areas surrounding Japan, according to our domestic law, to cope with that kind of situation, if not Article 5 of the Security Treaty. So therefore, this requires a close US, ROK, and Japan coordination, including the issues related to evacuation of foreign nationals from the Korean Peninsula, including Japanese, who might be as many as 50,000. It's a huge, big number of people. So that's all I could say on the refugees. And I could make further comments, but maybe I keep it later.
Thanks. Dr. Shin.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I also thank Asan Institution for having me this interesting seminar and gathering these wonderful people here. There is some benefit and problem as a last speaker. The benefit is I have more time to think about. The problem is if the former speakers are good, I have nothing to say. I think I have nothing to say, but I have to say something. So I would like to focus on the scenarios, how North Korean refugee occurs. And then I'm going to briefly discuss how big the refugee will be. The first one is the scenarios. When we estimate the stability of North Korea and the possible scenarios of the North Korean refugee occurs, we first should not underestimate North Korea's stability. North Korea regime, although it looks like very unstable at the superficial, but the regime is like a religious group, I think. In religious group, there is a God, and those people who believe in that religion, do not blame God itself. They blame probably officers, ministers, but they do not believe in their God. That's the North Korea's system. The Kim's family made their regime as like a religious group. So they are stronger than we expected. That's my first point. So the possibility of a mass refugee occur is not high. I think it's very difficult, but someday it might occur, so we have to prepare this. There are three possible scenarios the mass North Korean refugee occurs. First one is a famine, economic problem. As we noticed in 1990s, during the North Korea's economic collapse at the time, there was a huge famine in North Korea. If those famine occur again, the situation will be different. At the time, there's no external information infiltrated inside North Korea. But this day, last 10 years, there's many information spread over North Korea. So the regime itself is weakened. So if today North Korea is pursuing kind of their strategy, they announced their strategy last month, which is so-called advancement of nuclear development and economic development side by side. That's their strategy. But if North Korea maintain nuclear development, they're going to face economic problem sooner or later. That's the starting point of North Korea's collapse, or North Korea's sudden change, and start of a massive refugee. Second one is a possibility of internal military conflict. It is very hard to know whether North Korea has kind of a military faction, whether some military faction will stand against the Kim Jong-un regime. But at the end, there is a possibility. If Kim Jong-un regime fails to maintain their economy, in that case, some military faction opposed Kim Jong-un, and there is a possibility of internal military conflict. If that is the case, there is a possibility of a refugee, just like we noticed in Africa and Eastern Europe. But the size of a refugee in this case is not so big, because there's no such a racial conflict or religious conflict inside North Korea. So it's not like Rwanda. But anyway, that is another possible scenario. Last scenario is military conflict between North Korea and South Korea. It might start with a local conflict, but it might escalate to the theater level, all-out war. So in that case, some North Korean people, or many North Korean people, flee to China or Russia. I don't know the size, but there will be probably those people who are very loyal to Kim Jong-un regime. If they might see that they are going to defeat it, they probably want to flee to China or otherwhere else. So these are three scenarios. So important one is then, if that is the case, how big the size of refugee will be. But it depends upon the seriousness of the situation. So I'm just want just to mention that the worst scenarios. In Korean study, there are many studies, not many, some studies regarding the size of North Korean refugee. And one says there will be, in worst case, there will be more than 2 million North Korean refugees going outside of North Korea. The assumption of the study is the analysis of the Korean War. During the Korean War in 1950s, it started in 1950 and ended in 1953. At that time, almost 900,000 people come down to South Korea. At that time, North Korea's population is 9.5 million. It's almost 9% of North Korean people. Basic that assumption. Today, North Korea's population is probably 24 millions. And if the 9 point, that will be almost more than 2 million people. That's the basic assumption of that. But I think that is too high, not realistic. And so another issue I'm going to quote is the issued by Sindonghwa, New Asia Monthly magazine. It issued in October 2010, if my memory is correct. At the time, Han Kwan-soo, the author, he was the former Korean military officer. He analyzed the situation. He announced that probably if there is a sudden change in North Korea, 700,000 North Korean people flee to outside. He analyzed the Korean War and the German case, as Dr. Eberstadt mentioned, and then he assumes that among those 700,000, 470,000 people go to China. The majority go to China, and 9,000 people go to Russia, and 3,600 go to Japan, and to South Korea is more than 200,000 people. So I think this is very reasonable, depend upon the situation. So we have to prepare that kind of a refugee. And then the issue is how we, international community, in particular those neighboring countries, China, Japan, Russia, Korea, cooperate. I have another issue of this point, but I will talk later because I spent too many time. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Shin, you've talked about this a little bit already, but I'd like to just run through the others and ask you a very simple question just to outline. Will North Korea collapse? If so, how will it collapse? And when will it collapse? Dr. Bennett, maybe you'd like to go first.
I love uncertainties. And so I have to say it could collapse. It certainly is showing that it is a failed state in many ways. That suggests that the chances of collapse are relatively high, but that could happen next month, and it could happen 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. If it does happen, it probably happens because of assassination of the leader or leadership. We see reports from late last year of an assassination attempt, not the fake one that flew through the Chinese media, but another one. You see Kim Jong-un putting all kinds of military security around himself with heavy weapons. He's apparently concerned, so that seems to be a path, but that doesn't mean that you'll see government collapse. That may just be regime. Someone may simply take over in his place. So for it to be government collapse, it would then have to be that effectively no single leader can take over, that they splinter into factions and divide up. That seems like that's relatively possible. There's no clear successor for Kim Jong-un. Why in the world would he want to designate one at this stage? And so it's quite possible that it could fall into factions. Now, one of the factions might eventually be able to reestablish control, but that civil war that would likely envision would potentially be very close to as bad a situation as you could get.
So you think it could happen any time, but if it happens, it's likely to be quite sudden, quite dramatic?
Probably sudden and dramatic because it's a matter of at what day did he get shot.
Right.
And that's going to be very hard to predict.
Yeah. Dr. Cheng.
Yes, I basically agree with Bruce's opinions. And the DPRK is authoritarian countries, so ruled by one family. Such a kind of power structures pose very important vulnerabilities for possible regime change. If regime change, it will change dramatically, and maybe that will be the official process of unifications.
As you may know, I'm very closely associated with the so-called collapsist theory from the 1990s. I thought there's a very good chance the DPRK would collapse in the 1990s. I was obviously wrong. My analysis focused on, I guess, what you would call economic collapse, which sounds very squishy and loosey-goosey, but I think there's a very specific meaning to that phenomenon, which is if you see a breakdown in the division of labor in a country, when people can no longer sell their work for food, you have, in effect, a system that is economically collapsing. And we have seen that in the past. We saw that in Germany before the end of the war. We saw that in Japan before the end of the war. We saw that, where I was mentioning before, in the U.S. South before the end of that war. It's not a pretty thing to behold. It creates humanitarian tragedies, huge movements of people out of cities. I think the DPRK had signs of that in its economic duress of the mid-1990s, but it didn't go that far. didn't go to a total economic collapse. I don't think the DPRK is in terribly great economic health now. At the end of the day, I don't think we'll know about this until after it's over. I mean, I think if the lesson from the Soviet collapse and the Eastern European collapse is you go back to the archives afterwards, and then you learn all sorts of things that you didn't know. But just think about that, about the German analogy. At the time when the wall came down, German public opinion in the West saying they didn't expect Eastern Germany to change for 40 years. It was the period in inter-German history in which the expectation of reunification was actually lowest of any period in time.
Thank you.
Okay.
Miyake.
Lucy, the same question?
Yes.
I'm not a government official anymore, so I cannot give you that information for free. You have to hire me as a consultant. But having said that, I have three things to share with you. First of all, dictatorship is so resilient and strong and survive. I only visited DPRK once about 2 years ago, and despite all the propaganda and all the misinformation, I still believe that they are strong regime, still. This number two I'd like to share with you is this kind of analogy. I always say, talk about Kim Jong-un as a third heir, the grandfather and father and grandson, so the heir, successor to a small family business. Okay, his grandfather and his father knew exactly how small it is. This is just a family business of Kim Il-sung and sons. However, my worry is that Kim Jong-un might have misunderstood, might have made miscalculation, and his company he inherited would be as big as Hyundai or as big as Nissan, if not General Motors. So if this kind of miscalculation happens, that'll be the end of the family. But number three, it may not be the end of the DPRK. And of course, this is I'm not an expert on North Korea, but my hunch is this: China, for example, needs a buffer state, and if something's wrong with the Kim family, they may dump the Kim family members, but they will retain the DPRK. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. First question, will North Korea collapse? I think yes. And I slightly change it, Dr. Bennett's words. As possible, I'm going to say inevitable. Under the earth, I just remember what President Lincoln said at Gettysburg. Only the government or the regime of the people, by the people, for the people, exists forever. I think what North Korea is doing now is against their own people, against the interest of their own people. So it will collapse. The problem is when. That's my answer.
And
when? How? I mentioned that it starts with its economic problem. But the regime itself will not collapse only economic problem because the regime itself doesn't care of their own people. So finally they face the internal conflict, probably coup, and those factions get rid of Kim's family. That's the end of Kim's regime. And the last question is when? This is the problem, but I don't know.
It's very honest.
One second. I lived and I got posted in Baghdad twice. And Saddam didn't fall by himself. Mm-hmm. Iraq was attacked, and he had to go. In the case of Libya, it's the same. It was the NATO forces who, drove him away. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the North Korea is doomed or inevitably fall. Mm-hmm. That's my feeling. Mm.
We've seen a lot of actions by North Korea over the last year or so. Does the rest of the panel agree with Mr. Miyake that that North Korea is strong, at least at the moment? Is it stable and secure at the moment? Perhaps you're shaking your head there, so perhaps...
No. I look at North Korea, when they do their provocations, they're doing it mainly for internal political purposes. Yeah, there's a deterrent aspect. Yes, they're trying to impress the military with their support of the military. But primarily, they're doing it for internal political purposes. The more severe the provocations, the more serious the provocations, the more they're worried about their internal political problems, it seems to me. What are they trying to do? They're trying to divert the population from the regime as the enemy to the U.S. and South Korea as the enemy. There are other reasons. I mean, they're trying to prove they're empowered. They're trying to prove they're very capable in a case where, obviously, for their economic situations, they aren't very empowered. They aren't very capable. They make lots of mistakes. But fundamentally, it seems to me that they show their weakness when they make more extreme provocations, and the bluster recently suggests to me there are problems. But the other side of the problems is, look at the security around Kim Jong-un. Again, I think that the regime collapses when Kim Jong-un is assassinated. He has changed the nature of security. He now has uniformed people around him with heavy weapons, heavy individual weapons. That's not the image I saw with Kim Jong-il. So I think he is also concerned about this possibility.
Can I jump in on that? I agree with what Bruce has said, and I'd like to amplify that. I mean, Kim Jong-il was not just a bad ruler. He was a catastrophically bad ruler for that country, and it wasn't just the people who died in the famine. I mean, a lot of them were hostile class. They're happy to see them go away. He left his legatees perilously little. I mean, among the things which happened in the Kim Jong-il era was a kind of a gutting of the institutions of the totalitarian state, a kind of a ruining of the party and ruining of the state administration. And this was fine for the sun god because he was the indispensable one, and he could, more or less run the absolute power central from his bathtub with his court and his secret police. But it's a real problem for Junior, because on his watch now they have to rebuild the state and rebuild the party. And you can see that going on. The party's coming back, kind of out of the shadows. There's talk about reinstitutionalizing the state and moving back towards something more like economic planning. It's a fascinating thing that Kim Jong-un should give a speech to the Central Committee last year where practically his first words were, I've noticed that many of our cadres don't understand or appreciate my father's revolutionary contributions. I mean, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that the cadres think they were given a great deal by Pops.
Dr. Cheng.
I'd like to say that when we examine DPRK's histories, I think now today's DPRK in the most dangerous period of time for a number of reasons. Number reason one is the young leader is too young. And in the past 1 year, from my personal perspective, he made some big mistakes. And the mistakes may encourage his followers or social aides, colleagues, to challenge his authorities. Such a challenge may lead to assassination, also all of a sudden overwork, all of a sudden something unprecedented happens. This is one thing. Second is the DPRK suffer unprecedented diplomatic isolations. It's never seen in histories. So the external pressure is enormous. So the enormous external pressures will make the young leaders to make some stupid mistake. And third reasons, the DPRK's relationship with China, you see, has been tangibly alienated. And we don't know how the relationship between China and the DPRK will develop in the futures. The bottom line is China does not want to transform the DPRKs as its enemy. That's the bottom line. But China probably, we don't know who can cross the bottom line. The bottom line doesn't matter. So as an important supporter and suppliers of lifelines for the DPRKs, and Kim Jong-un's made mistake and alienated China. So all in all, you see in comparison with his fathers, grandfathers, and the DPRK is in a very dangerous place.
Okay. Let me respond to Miyake's case. He made a case like Iraq and Libya.
No, Iraq.
No, Iraq and
Iran, not yet.
Iraq, Libya, okay. Yes, external military intervention cleared the situation in Iraq and Libya, right? I agree that. But Iraq and Libya has oil, no? They can make foreign currency, US dollar, through that kind of oil. In case of North Korea, they have to develop their kind of system. That was Kaesong, that was Hwanggeunpyeong and Nasan area. They tried to develop that area to make a foreign currency. Sometimes they export their labor to China and made the money from them, external currency, US dollar. But if North Korea make such a stupid decision, just did the Kaesong industrial complex, they are going to face a serious problem. And that time, that will be a starting point of a disagreement, internal core member of North Korean people. So we cannot preclude the possibility of a serious problem inside North Korea.
Okay.
I'm not precluding that kind of possibility, as I said at the beginning. What I'm trying to make is that we should carefully separate the fate of Kim family and the fate of DPRK. You see, yes, they don't have any oil, but they got oil from somewhere else, right? And we don't go into details. So that somewhere else doesn't want to see the fall of DPRK. So we should focus on that, and see, then we can make predictions. But it's not going to be a simple fall of Kim family and DPRK together. It may be different. So we should carefully study those different possibilities.
To that point, I agree.
Just one more question before I throw it open to the floor. How prepared do you think South Korea is for any eventual collapse and to deal with the refugee problem? And also, particularly Dr. Cheng perhaps could answer, China's reportedly been nervous about talking about that. Is it actually talking about it and thinking about it?
You see, whether or not the DPRK could survive, it has something to do with itself. Even with China's support, if DPRK will die, it will die. And I think it's for China, the value of the DPRKs, strategic values of the DPRKs actually changed dramatically. And I don't believe the DPRKs is any buffer zones anymore. And Jia Qingguo mentioned missiles. It's not about technology. It's about confidence. It's about the power of these countries. Which country dare to invade China today? Why we need DPRKs of buffer zones? So that's not the case. And also, a Japanese friends mentioned some countries does not want the DPRKs falls. And that's not always not. It's for some Chinese that believe support the DPRK serve China's interests. That's real. Some of Chinese, that's real. But some Chinese began to call Chinese government to abandon the DPRKs, because DPRKs is some Chinese perceive as troublemakers, and also squeeze Chinese strategic space, and also tarnish Chinese international image, and also prevent China to exercise its right to offer a collective good to these regions as a whole. So I think if situation in the DPRK, particularly in Pyongyang, experience dramatic change, such as regime change, and I think the Chinese government need to prepare to brace the ultimate result, means the unification of the Korean Peninsula. Morally, if China stand on the way to prevent the unifications, China morally wrong, and also will establish the state on Korean Peninsula as its perennial enemy. I don't think China will stupid to do so.
Okay. What do others feel about how prepared countries are, South Korea? Dr. Eberstadt?
How prepared? Woefully un. But it's not just the lack of policy planning. I mean, obviously there's been some policy planning. It's not just the lack of policy planning. It's the crushing lack of knowledge about the existing human contours in the North. And this is, if I may say so, inexcusable as we're heading towards almost 20 years of nonstop emergency humanitarian relief towards for the DPRK. It is a shame and worse that the World Food Program and other international relief organizations have been so timid over the past almost 20 years that they haven't demanded from the DPRK the information that would have allowed them to do their jobs. And if we had had that information, we'd know a lot better the sorts of humanitarian situations that we may face if the circumstances we're talking about come to pass.
Yeah.
Please, yeah.
Can I jump on it? I just want to share with you another experience in Beijing. About 10 years ago, I was minister at our embassy in Beijing, and that very topic, whether the People's Republic of China welcomes the Korean unification or not, it was one of the biggest questions I had at that time. So between year 2000 and 2004, I've been raising the same questions to as many Chinese scholars and party members as possible. But at that time, the voices to welcome the unification was so small that almost nobody wanted to speak out. But I'm glad, finally, the Chinese scholars, at least, and even the party school deputy chief of editor, just referred to that possibility. What a big change. I welcome that. But having said that, I don't think they are ready yet. I think they are sending a message to North Korea, but they're not ready yet for the unification.
And I'd like to add one word, sorry.
Yes, Dr. Cheng, then Dr. Shin.
And the Global Times, China's government mouthpiece, and once published, once editorials, mentioned the possible China and DPRK split, like what happened in the early 1960s between China and the Soviet Union. And also these articles maintained China prepare for the worst, and the DPRKs need to more worried about such situations. So,
Dr. Shin?
Yes, it's our government preparation. It's a very sensitive issue for me because of confidentiality. But I think the general direction of our government policy should be focused on the prevention rather than respond to the collapse. If a collapse occurs and if there are many North Korean refugees occurs, it is very hard to control. Even we work together. Our neighboring country work together. We need many resources, and there's a huge humanitarian disaster. So I think we have to focus on the prevention. And our government issued the so-called Korean Peninsula, trust process. This is the kind of policy to prevent North Korea's collapse and cooperate with the neighboring country to lead North Korea to the proper direction. So that's our main focus. And if collapse occurs, I think we should focus on the humanitarian assistance. That's the main policy. And then deals with the other issues. But at this point, the problem is North Korea's nuclear program. No? If North Korea addict their nuclear weapon, it is very hard to, not only for South Korea, but also for those neighboring countries to cooperate with North Korea if they continue to develop nuclear weapon. That's the problem. Thank you.
I think one of the biggest differences between Germany just before the collapse of East Germany and North Korea is the East Germans generally felt that unification was going to be good for Germans, for the East Germans in particular. Now, they weren't always right about that, but that was where they felt. I don't think you have that same feeling in North Korea today that the North Koreans do. And I think that that really fundamentally depends upon action that the ROC has to take to prepare the people of North Korea to tell them there's life after unification. And here are some of the specifics of life after unification so that you can be assured. You're not going to be thrown in prison. You're not going to be shot. You do have an economic opportunity after that time. More than food, more than anything else, if we have to fight every North Korean because they think it's a disaster, that is going to be the worst situation to be in with unification.
Great, thank you. Questions? Yes, over here. There's a microphone coming to you, I think.
Thank you. Greg Scarlatti, Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. I have a question for Professor Cheng. We have been talking about critical future scenarios. My question will focus on the present. The People's Republic of China is a rising superpower, fully worthy of our admiration and respect, and also a party to the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. North Korean refugees in China continue to be forcibly repatriated to North Korea. Pursuant to the 1951 Convention, if a person is repatriated and faces severe punishment, torture, death, based on political reasons, that person automatically qualifies to become réfugié sur place, refugee on site, automatically qualifies for political refugee status, access to the ICRC and the High Commissioner for Refugees. China continues to repatriate these refugees, claiming that they're economic migrants. And my question to you is actually a request for advice. What can groups such as ours, North Korea, human rights, research and advocacy groups do to persuade the government of the People's Republic of China to stop the forcible repatriation of North Korean refugees? Is it that we need to do more research? Is it that we need to better document these cases? Is it that we're not going through the proper channels?
Thank you. Is that directed to Dr. Cheng?
Dr. Cheng, yes.
Answer
Please,
right
yeah.
now? Okay. So tough questions. And also, so number one is I personally is quite sympathetic to the so-called North Korean refugees because the refugee issue is not aliens for China. And traditionally, China has been a source of refugees. Chinese people fled to some other countries, Hong Kong, even DPRK, during cultural revolutions. And some other countries in attempt to seek good life. And they got caught, and some was repatriated to China. It's not, but now China changed to become a more important destination of refugees from DPRK, Myanmar, even some countries, some people from Vietnam, the neighboring countries. Basically, most of them come to China in attempt to seek good life, good pay, good job. And only a small percentage of the refugees came to China because of the political reasons from China's experience. But as you mentioned, refugee issues are not pure humanitarian issues. It's also some political issues. This is one thing. Secondly, is, as you mentioned, forceful repatriations of the North Korea refugees back to North Korea is some kind of violations of international conventions and human rights. But I have to remind the peoples in the rooms, China as a developing countries, it has its own human rights problems. So when Chinese suffer human rights problems, how you can ask the Chinese government to be more lenient and more open-minded to the people who come from other countries. So that's the big issues. That's the big issues. But as I mentioned, that's a political issues. How to settle this issue, how to reduce the people's sufferings, particularly some of the North Korean refugees. And it could be arranged through diplomatic channels, such as the channels between the ROK and China, and also China and the DPRKs, because China is a middleman. And they face the pressures from the DPRK and ROKs. So how to settle this kind of dilemmas is also a diplomatic problem Chinese government needed to settle.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, lots. Okay, over here.
Hi, my name is Seokhyun Ha from Asan Young Fellow, and my question is, North Korea has been focused on making nuclear weapons. Then do you think is it possible that North Korea make a war or shoot missile right before their collapse?
Okay, thanks. Actually, we'll get a couple of questions because we haven't got very long. Just over there at the back.
Joseph Sternberg with the Wall Street Journal. To whoever is brave enough to take this, it seems like we're talking about North Korea refugee situation as if it would be the only problem that we would face in this region at the time. And I'm just curious about, if you envision a scenario if a collapse in North Korea is accompanied by some kind of instability in the regime in China, how does that affect planning for dealing with the North Korea situation? At that point, is it even possible to really think about planning for North Korea, or would our focus be elsewhere? Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions or just those two? Okay. Oh, sorry, just stand down the front.
Thanks. John Swenson-Wright, University of Cambridge. My question is for Mr. Miyake. You've stressed the importance in terms of the refugee risks to Japan of contingency planning. Given the past bold, some would say brave, attempt by former Prime Minister Koizumi to normalize relations with the DPRK, what's your assessment of the current situation within Japan, both in terms of Mr. Abe's own personal predilection to pursue a similar strategy to his conservative predecessors, and also the strength of the abducted family members as a constraining force preventing any such normalization?
Thanks. Okay. Who'd like to take those questions?
I just want to make it short.
Sure.
May I?
Yeah.
To your question, and the rest should be answered by others. As far as I know, the solution to the abduction issue is a key to the normalization with North Korea. So I think there must be some kind of low-level contacts, hopefully. But I have, to the best of my knowledge, this moment so far, we haven't heard anything positive from the DPRK side. So we will continue to pursue that possibility in close coordination with other friends and allies in this region. Thank you.
Dr. Bennett?
On the question about nuclear weapon use, there's a 2008 foreign policy article in the fall of 2008 talking about the first nuclear crisis, where Kim Il-sung brought in his military people and asked them if they could win in a fight with the Americans. The answer was yes, they could, of course. He then asked them what they would do if they lost in a fight with the Americans, which would be equivalent to a collapse, potentially. And Kim Jong-il reportedly spoke up and said, "If we lose, I will destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea?" I think that's the answer to your question.
Let me put it this way. Yes, from the military planner's perspective, we cannot preclude any option. We prepare the worst scenarios. But what purpose and to whom? That's the matter. What purpose North Korea regime use its nuclear weapon during its collapse, and to whom? South Korea and United States? Whether they have that kind of capability? Not now, at least. But when studying North Korea is likely to be a fortune teller. Sometimes we used to predict, we don't know based on the fact. But anyway, we cannot preclude, but it is very unlikely. If there is a certain purpose that do not exist, it is very hard for them to use nuclear weapon, even if they deploy nuclear weapon. Thank you.
And there was a question there at the back about, was it how instability inside China itself would affect planning for this scenario? Yes. Who'd like to take that? Mr. Cheng.
Actually, I share Dr. Shin's 3 scenarios. Actually, in my papers, I prepared 3 scenarios. But I like to discuss this issue in a very brief way. I hope Chinese government can keep in mind a number of things. Number one, if the refugee issues really become hot, and China will become the major destinations of the North Korean refugee. Secondly, if the situation is worse off, China needs to prepare to intervene in a swift and forceful ways, include rolling back, set up refugee camp within the DPRKs, and also needed to take care of the nuclear facilities. It's 100 kilometers from Chinese borders. And the third, if the massive refugees happened, China needs to prepare to embrace the ultimate unifications and adopt a proactive approach to work with the ROK, United States, and some other countries to make a post-unification arrangement that serve China's national interest, include the companies and peoples in the DPRK.
Thank you. We're about out of time, so thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to our panel, and thanks to Asan as well for organising everything.
Thank you.